James worked as an EMT, and he had never thought that one day he would need one himself. It was a typical end of the shift for James. It was about 8 in the morning on a clear sunny day when he was driving home from a 24-hour shift. Something jumped from the trees at the side of the road. James swerved to avoid what he realized was not a person, as he had thought, but a deer. James had crossed the road and traveled into a culvert at 55 miles per hour. Hard on the brakes, he impacted a raised driveway and catapulted into the air. He slammed into the airbag as it exploded into his face. His ankle shattered against the brake pedal. Smashing through the rail fence, he sailed over the driveway for about 15 feet. James impacted a grassy area, grill first, and his Camry started tumbling. During the first end over end, his entire left side impacted the driver's door. Shattered glass rained down upon him. The second rotation caused the steering wheel to land on his head. During the third rotation, he was so disorientated, he wasn't sure what happened. At some point during this ride wreck, his neck fractured. James's vehicle finally came to rest, right side up, facing towards the road. It was destroyed in the accident. Not one window or the sunroof was intact. The battery was flung 50 feet. The police would later figure the car had rotated 4 times. There was not one undamaged panel. James's upper body was laying across the center console with his head face down in the passenger seat. A few moments later, a family van stopped on the side of the road. The driver saw the skid marks on the asphalt and the bent guardrail and knew immediately that there had been an accident. 15 minutes later, the local air ambulance was at the scene. They were dispatched to transport James in a critical condition to a hospital as fast as possible. The medical professionals were waiting for them and rushed James through to ICU. James didn't remember any of this, of course. This was what he had been told. When the assessment started, he was doing one thing, which meant he had a chance of survival, so was blue-lighted to a specialist hospital about an hour away. It would take James several months before he would regain consciousness, and a week before he could recognize people around him. But what shocked James and his wife the most was how he came back. Before the accident, James was employed as an EMT in a charming small town. He would regularly express his dissatisfaction to his wife about the tedious nature of his job, as it involved copious amounts of paperwork. James yearned for the opportunity to be on the front lines, actively saving lives and attending to emergency calls. As time went on, James's longing for action was eventually fulfilled. He found himself responding to a major incident which put his skills to the ultimate test. This experience not only made him realize the value of the boring aspects of his job, but also deepened his understanding of how those administrative tasks contributed to the overall efficiency of the emergency response system. Conversely, James understood that a lack of calls signified no emergencies, and thus no danger for the people in his community. At times, the idea of longing for action seemed paradoxical to him, as he was aware that a peaceful and safe environment meant there would be no need for urgent interventions. This internal conflict challenged James to reevaluate his perspective on the true purpose and value of his job as an EMT. Before embarking on his career as an EMT, James had worked in a fast food restaurant. After marrying his wife Luna, he decided to pursue a certification as an EMT. The process took him only 3 months, and upon completion, he found himself earning $5 more per hour compared to his previous job. This significant pay raise came from a relatively easy-to-obtain certification, and James was delighted to secure a full-time position just a week after graduation. However, the real financial advantage for James lay in the overtime hours he worked, which greatly contributed to his overall income and job satisfaction. The work wasn't very difficult. Vast majority of calls just needed a ride to the ER. He also had plenty of shifts where he got to relax or nap for a decent chunk of the shift. James often picked up extra shifts. There was always someone calling out. He wasn't getting extremely rich, but it was a decent living in a respected career that didn't take long to get into. James loved his job and knew it was a responsible job. Every second could make the biggest and most important difference. Majority of shifts weren't bad, but there was always the possibility of having that call that he would remember for years. In his 15 years of career as an EMT, he had saved a lot of people. He also remembered some of the toughest cases. He remembered clearly the first ever patient that he lost. He was an elderly man who was having an asthma attack. That day, they spent too much time on the scene. 10 seconds after placing the man in the back of the ambulance, James watched him take his last breath. This was his very first cardiac arrest as a paramedic. Even with the help of firefighters, they were unable to resuscitate him. It happened at the beginning of his career, and James always kicked himself for not having more experience. He thought he could possibly do things differently, but as the attending physician at the hospital once told him, "When it's your time to go, it's your time to go." This case continued to haunt James, frequently leaving him feeling depressed and overwhelmed by the memory. The other case that he couldn't shake off his mind was when the relationship with his wife was a bit rocky. They were living in a trailer and struggling financially. But the biggest reason for arguing was the fact that the couple had been trying to have a baby, but it wasn't working out. At the time, James was drinking more than he should have. That day, it was 30 minutes prior to the end of his shift. As he was playing pool with the firefighter, the tones dropped for a shooting. They arrived on scene just after the police to find a young woman sitting on the front porch crying. Apparently, she had argued with her boyfriend who had recently moved in with her. Then she went to visit a friend to cool down and came home to find him dead. It was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. James had to see the young man lying on the ground lifeless and confirm death for the police. James and his girlfriend were about the same age as them. That evening, he went back to the trailer and hugged his girlfriend for 15 minutes, sobbing. It was a turning point in his life. From that day on, he realized that life is so fragile and can be taken away any minute. Determined to make a positive change, James pulled himself together and quit drinking. He and Luna shared the dream of having a baby together. 2 years later, the young couple took another significant step forward by moving into a cozy little house, making it a warm and welcoming home in anticipation of starting a family. However, even after 5 years of trying, James and Luna still found themselves unable to conceive a child. This challenging situation tested the resilience of their relationship and forced them to confront the reality that their dream might not come to fruition. That fateful day of the accident, James had another fight with his wife. In the heat of emotions, he said to Luna that there was no point in living if he couldn't have a baby. That same day, he would get into an accident and go into a coma. The hallway of the hospital was busy with medical workers rushing from room to room. The consultants had previously warned James' parents to prepare for their son as being unable to walk, talk, or even identify them again. Once inside the specialist hospital, James was plugged into a life support machine, which was where he stayed unconscious. The moment the medical professionals had to usher his parents out of the room due to the fact that they thought they were going to lose him, James remembered looking down on himself. He saw that there were several people working around his bed, but it was completely peaceful where he was. It was like looking through a wide aperture in that there was a lot of light present, but the focus was soft. James was aware, but curiously removed from what was going on. In those moments, he was one step removed from everyday reality, just observing. There was no pressure from anything, no obligation to be anywhere or do anything. Time became an irrelevant concept. It just didn't matter anymore. James remembered to his left was the most pure and nourishing white light coming from a window. He could feel like he could move towards whatever he looked at and directed his thoughts at. He looked at the doctors working around his body and looked at the source of light again. He had a feeling he wanted to see what was beyond it. All it took was just a thought and he started floating towards the light. When he passed a thick layer of white light, it dissipated and he saw an old man sitting on the bench in the park. James recognized the man. It was the same man who had died from cardiac arrest. He was smiling at James and telling him that what the physician told him was true. When it's your time to go, it's your time to go. James smiled back at the old man and asked, "Is it my time to go? Do you know?" At that moment, the old man just stood up from the bench and walked away. James felt weak and lost. He had a feeling that it was indeed his time to go. He looked around trying to find the source of white light. It was gone. Meanwhile, in the physical world, doctors were shrugging their shoulders. It had been a month since James was in a coma. The doctors told James's parents and wife that they're monitoring his state and will let them know if anything changes. Luna found herself gradually succumbing to depression. Each morning, she anxiously awaited news about her husband. She hoped for updates that he had regained consciousness, yet simultaneously dreaded the possibility of receiving devastating news. However, on that particular Sunday morning, fate had a different plan for her. Luna awoke around 6 a.m., disturbed by a lingering sensation of nausea. The feeling intensified, prompting her to believe she would vomit at any moment. She quickly rose and dashed to the bathroom. After several minutes of retching, however, nothing came out. Luna was worried. She thought she had messed up her stomach by not eating properly recently. She spent the entire morning in bed, feeling utterly drained. In the afternoon, she decided to drive to the hospital. Sitting beside James, she gently held his hand. It was quiet in the room. Luna gazed at her husband for a long time, tears streaming down her face as she reflected on the days when they used to argue. The memory of their last argument remained etched in her mind, and she replayed the scenes over and over, causing her tears to flow even more freely. That day, Luna decided to spend the night at the hospital. Consumed by loneliness, she found the thought of returning to an empty home unbearable. In the meantime, James experienced a vivid dream in which he found himself wandering through a vast desert. In the distance, he spotted a pond, shimmering like a mirage. Despite feeling as though he had been walking for days, the elusive pond never seemed to get any closer. James yearned to dive into its refreshing waters and quench his seemingly insatiable thirst. At some point, he heard someone say his name. James. James. It's time. The sand beneath him appeared to be sinking into an abyss, while the daylight gradually gave way to darkness. Overwhelmed by his situation, James began to cry. Falling to his knees, he desperately pleaded for help and a way out of the desolate dreamscape that held him captive. Instinctively, he started praying. I've always longed for a child. Whoever's listening, please let me see my child before I'm gone. I just want to catch a glimpse of them. At that moment, everything around him started to turn white again. He didn't know where he was. He started hearing voices again, but this time the voices sounded familiar to him. They were the doctor's voices, and the white light surrounding him was the flashlight directed at his pupils. Next, he heard his wife sobbing as she leaned toward him. James didn't understand why, but he found himself crying too. His wife held something in her hands, and through her tears, he could see a faint smile on her face. The voices and words gradually became clearer to James. Luna was cradling their baby, wrapped snugly in a blanket and attempting to show the infant to James. "Welcome back, honey. Welcome back," she exclaimed through a mix of laughter and tears. "Do you recognize me? I'm your wife, Luna." Her eyes sparkled with emotion as she beamed and cried simultaneously. The room was filled with warmth and happiness, as everyone around them couldn't help but smile at the miraculous reunion. James felt a mixture of surprise and bewilderment. He couldn't immediately recognize the people around him, and he struggled to comprehend his surroundings. His mind was still reeling from the vivid dream, which blurred the line between fantasy and reality. "Hello, darling," Luna said, smiling as she wiped away her tears. Gently, she leaned in and planted a tender kiss on James's forehead, all the while cradling their precious baby in her arms. "Here's your little princess," Luna announced, adjusting the swaddle so James could get a better look. Overwhelmed with emotion, James was unable to hold back his tears. His face contorted as he wept silently, too weak to make any sounds or utter a single word. Luna tenderly stroked James's cheek, her gaze switching between her husband and their newborn daughter as he continued to cry. In that moment, James came to the realization that he had been in a coma for a long time. 2 months into his coma, Luna had discovered she was pregnant with their little girl. From that day forward, she had prayed, asking God to grant her wish for their baby to meet her father. Just 3 days prior to James regaining consciousness, Luna had given birth to a healthy and beautiful baby girl, making their reunion even more miraculous and joyous. "Did you see her, babe? Did you see your daughter? Isn't she cute? She looks just like you, babe." Luna was showing the baby to James, who by now was crying tears of happiness. The medical team had been uncertain whether James would ever awaken from his coma. However, his deep-seated desire to see his daughter proved to be a powerful force, ultimately overcoming the coma and allowing him to reunite with his family against all odds. This remarkable recovery testified to the indomitable strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable bond between a parent and the child. "She's so cute, James," Luna was saying. "See, honey, she's healthy and beautiful." The moment of meeting his daughter proved to be the greatest and most surprising gift James could have ever received. He attempted to speak, but his lips failed to form any words. Despite his miraculous awakening, James had a long road ahead of him. The medical team cautioned his loved ones that his recovery would require a great deal of time and effort, spanning several years. The experience of his coma had a profound impact on James, leaving him acutely aware of the fragility of life. His dream remained vivid in his memory, and he recognized the beauty of simplicity. He found value in silence and space, and came to appreciate the deeper connections that exist between all things. He grew grateful for everything he had, cherishing every moment with his family and precious newborn daughter. James's near-death experience had gifted him with a newfound perspective on life, and he vowed to live every day to the fullest, embracing every opportunity to cherish his loved ones and to savor the simple pleasures of life. As he emerged from his coma, James began to view the world through a different lens. The things he once thought were important now appeared embarrassingly insignificant, while the things he had once taken for granted now held immeasurable value. The realization that life could be so fragile had given him a profound appreciation for the present moment and the people he held dear. James resolved to embrace every opportunity to savor life's simple pleasures and to cherish each and every moment